Sarah Mitchell woke up at 5:30 a.m., just like she did every morning. The early March sun hadn't risen yet in Boston, but she was already preparing for what would be one of the most important cases of her career. At 32 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to get to where she was, a senior attorney at Anderson and Brooks law firm. The morning was colder than usual, and Sarah could see her breath in the air as she walked to her car. She had picked out her outfit the night before, a navy blue suit that cost her an entire month's salary when she first started working. It was her lucky suit, the one she wore for special cases. Today was definitely a special case. As she drove through the quiet streets of Boston, Sarah thought about her journey. Growing up in a middle-class family in Maryland, her parents had always pushed her to excel. Her father, a high school teacher, and her mother, a nurse, had saved every penny they could for her education. When she got accepted to Harvard Law School, they had cried tears of joy. Now, 7 years after graduating, she was one of the youngest senior attorneys at her firm. Sarah stopped at her favorite coffee shop, where Mary, the owner, already had her usual order ready, a large black coffee with just a touch of cream. "Big case today?" Mary asked, noticing Sarah's formal attire. Sarah nodded, taking a sip of the perfectly made coffee. "The biggest one yet," she replied with a smile. The case was special for another reason. Her client was Thomas Reynolds Jr., who had been her friend since law school. When he called her last month about handling his divorce, Sarah had hesitated at first. Mixing friendship with business was always tricky, but Thomas had insisted there was no one else he trusted more. As she pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Sarah checked her phone. There were 3 messages from Thomas, all asking if she had arrived yet. She smiled, understanding his nervousness. Divorce cases were always emotional, but this one was particularly complex. Thomas came from a well-known family in Boston's legal community, and his father was a respected judge. Sarah gathered her materials from the car, her leather briefcase containing all the case files, her laptop, and a folder with additional documents she had prepared the night before. The courthouse steps were already busy with people coming and going, despite it being only 8:15 a.m. She recognized several other lawyers, nodding hello as she made her way up. Just as she reached the top of the steps, her phone rang. It was Jessica, her assistant at the firm. "Sarah, there's been an accident on Washington Street. Traffic is completely stopped. Thomas just called the office. He's stuck in it, and might be a few minutes late to court." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Judge Harrison, who was presiding over the case, was known for his strict punctuality. Being late to his courtroom was like committing a cardinal sin. She quickly texted Thomas, telling him to stay calm and that she would handle everything. Inside the courthouse, Sarah went through security, placing her belongings in the plastic bins for scanning. The security guard, Mike, who had seen her almost every day for the past 5 years, greeted her warmly. "Looking sharp today, Miss Mitchell," he said with a friendly smile. As she walked towards courtroom 3B, Sarah mentally rehearsed her opening statement. She had practiced it at least 20 times the night before, but she still wanted it to be perfect. This case wasn't just about Thomas' divorce. It was about proving that she deserved her reputation as one of Boston's top young attorneys. Sarah checked her watch, 8:45 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. She had time to review her notes one last time. Finding a quiet corner near the courtroom, she pulled out her files and began going through them methodically. Everything had to be perfect. What Sarah didn't know was that Judge Harrison had called in sick that morning. A replacement judge had been assigned to the case, Judge Harold Reynolds Sr., Thomas' father. This small detail would change everything about her day, leading to a series of events that would not only challenge her professional composure but also expose deeper-rooted biases in the legal system she had dedicated her life to serving. As the clock ticked closer to 9 a.m., Sarah gathered her things, took a deep breath, and walked towards the courtroom doors. She was ready for anything, or at least she thought she was. Sarah entered courtroom 3B at exactly 8:57 a.m. The room was already half full, with lawyers and their clients speaking in hushed tones. She noticed something was different right away. Instead of seeing Judge Harrison's usual clerk, there was someone new at the desk. Her stomach tightened. A different clerk usually meant a different judge. As she made her way to the front of the courtroom, Sarah quickly checked her phone again. Still no message from Thomas saying he had gotten through the traffic. She placed her briefcase on the defense table and began organizing her documents. The courthouse clock showed 8:59 a.m. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Reynolds Sr. presiding. Sarah's head snapped up at the name, but she kept her face calm and professional. She knew that name very well. Every lawyer in Boston did. Judge Reynolds was known for being strict, traditional, and sometimes harsh with his rulings. The judge walked in, his black robe flowing behind him. He was tall, with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. Sarah watched as he settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at the day's schedule. She could feel her heart beating faster. This was not part of her carefully planned morning. At 9:05 a.m., Thomas still hadn't arrived. Judge Reynolds looked up from his papers, scanning the courtroom with a frown. First case, he announced. Reynolds versus Reynolds. There was a pause as he noticed the empty seat beside Sarah. Where is the defendant? Sarah stood up quickly. Your Honor, my client is currently. But before she could finish her explanation, the judge cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. Are you the attorney of record? He asked, looking at her with what seemed like doubt in his eyes. Yes, Your Honor. I'm Sarah Mitchell from Anderson and Brooks Law Firm, representing Thomas Reynolds Jr. She kept her voice steady and professional, even as she noticed the judge's expression change slightly at the mention of his son's name. Miss Mitchell, court began at 9 a.m. sharp. It's now 9:07, and your client is nowhere to be seen. Furthermore, you failed to inform the court about any possible delays before the session began. Judge Reynolds' voice was cold and disapproving. Sarah tried again to explain. Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. There was an unexpected traffic accident on Washington Street. My client, that's enough, Miss Mitchell, Judge Reynolds interrupted again. I don't appreciate excuses in my courtroom. I'm holding you in contempt. The fine is $500, to be paid by the end of the day. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah stood there, feeling the eyes of everyone on her. She had heard stories about Judge Reynolds' strict courtroom manner, but experiencing it firsthand was different. She knew arguing would only make things worse, so she simply said, Yes, Your Honor, and sat down. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and Thomas rushed in, slightly out of breath. He was wearing an expensive gray suit, his dark hair slightly messy from running. I apologize for my tardiness, Your Honor, he said quickly, making his way to the front. Judge Reynolds looked up, and for the first time that morning, his stern expression faltered. His son was walking towards the defense table, where Sarah, the lawyer he had just fined, was sitting. Thomas leaned over and whispered something to Sarah, who nodded professionally. The judge's face went through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, realization, and then something that looked like embarrassment. He had just fined and dismissed his son's lawyer without giving her a chance to explain herself properly. The courtroom remained quiet as Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. He looked down at his papers, then back at Sarah and Thomas. The confident, stern judge from a few minutes ago seemed to have disappeared. In his place sat a man who was clearly struggling with the situation he had created. Miss Mitchell, he said finally, his voice noticeably softer, please approach the bench. Sarah stood up, her head held high, and walked forward. She could feel Delmas' supportive gaze following her. As she reached the bench, Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly. The next few minutes would change not only the course of the day but would also become a turning point in how justice was served in courtroom 3B. The morning's events had set the stage for an important lesson about assumptions, respect, and the need for change in the legal system. Sarah stood before Judge Reynolds at the bench, her back straight and her expression professional. The whispers in the courtroom had died down to complete silence. Everyone was watching this unexpected drama unfold between the strict judge, his son's lawyer, and his son. Miss Mitchell, Judge Reynolds said quietly, making sure only she could hear him. I believe we need to discuss this situation in my chambers. He turned to the bailiff and announced, "This court will take a 15-minute recess." The bang of his gavel echoed through the silent room. As Sarah turned to walk back to her table, she caught Thomas' eye. He looked worried and angry at the same time. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. This wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination in her career, but it was certainly the most public instance. In the judge's chambers, Sarah stood near the door, while Judge Reynolds sat heavily in his leather chair. The room was impressive, with walls lined with law books and certificates. A large window overlooked the Boston skyline, but neither of them was paying attention to the view. "Please sit down," Judge Reynolds said, gesturing to a chair. His voice had lost its earlier harshness. Sarah sat down, keeping her posture perfect, and her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that maintaining professionalism was her best defense in uncomfortable situations. "I owe you an apology, Miss Mitchell," the judge began, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "My behavior in the courtroom was inappropriate." He looked older now, more tired than stern. "I made assumptions that I shouldn't have made." Sarah took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, I appreciate your apology. However, I think we both know this isn't just about this morning's fine." Her voice was calm but firm. "This is about something much deeper." Judge Reynolds looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been a judge for 15 years. I've always prided myself on being fair and just, but today," he paused, struggling with his words, "today I saw something in myself that I'm not proud of." Just then there was a knock at the door. It was Thomas. He entered the room, looking between his father and Sarah. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Dad," Thomas said, his voice tight with emotion, "I can't believe what just happened out there. Sarah is one of the best lawyers in Boston. She graduated top of our class at Harvard. She's won more cases in the past year than most lawyers win in 5 years. Judge Reynolds held up his hand to stop his son. "I know, Thomas, the first know all about M. Mitchell's achievements. Now that's part of my shame. I should have known them before I made my judgment." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor, I don't want your shame. What I want is change, real change." She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "I've been keeping track of similar incidents in courtrooms across Boston. This isn't an isolated problem." The judge looked surprised as Sarah handed him the folder. Inside were carefully documented cases of bias in the courtroom, not just against black lawyers but against women and minorities in general. She had been collecting this data for years, waiting for the right moment to present it. "These are all from the past 2 years," she explained. "Each case represents someone who faced unfair treatment in our justice system, not because of their actions but because of how they looked or who they were." Judge Reynolds flipped through the pages, his face growing more serious with each one. Thomas moved closer to look over his father's shoulder, his expression changing from anger to shock as he read. "I had no idea it was this widespread," Thomas said quietly. His father remained silent, still reading through the documents. Finally, Judge Reynolds looked up at Sarah. "What do you suggest we do about this?" he asked. His voice was different now, not the voice of a judge speaking to a lawyer he had just fined, but of someone genuinely seeking guidance. Sarah sat up straighter. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "I have some ideas," she said, "but first we need to return to the courtroom. We have a divorce case to handle professionally, and then we can discuss how to make real changes in our legal system." The judge nodded, standing up as they prepared to return to the courtroom. All three of them knew that this morning's incident had opened a door that couldn't be closed. What had started as a simple divorce case had become something much more important, a chance for real change in the Boston legal system. When they returned to the courtroom, everyone could feel that something had changed. Judge Reynolds sat straighter in his chair, and his first action surprised the entire room. He cleared his throat and addressed the court in a clear, strong voice. "Before we continue with today's proceedings, I need to make a public statement," he announced. "I owe M. Mitchell an apology. My earlier actions were inappropriate and show poor judgment. The contempt charge and fine are dismissed." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Please proceed with your case, Miss Mitchell." Sarah stood up, her case files neatly arranged before her. The other lawyers in the courtroom watched with interest. It wasn't every day they saw Judge Reynolds admit he was wrong. Some of them had been practicing in front of him for years and had never witnessed anything like this. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said professionally. "In the matter of Reynolds versus Reynolds, we are here today to discuss the terms of divorce between Thomas Reynolds Jr. and Elizabeth Reynolds." Her voice was clear and confident, showing no sign of the earlier confrontation. As Sarah presented the case, she noticed Judge Reynolds paying careful attention to every word she said. He listened without interrupting, nodded at her key points, and treated her with the respect she had earned through years of hard work. The change in his behavior was subtle but clear to everyone in the courtroom. Thomas sat quietly beside her, watching his father and his lawyer interact. He felt proud of both of them, Sarah for handling the situation with such grace and professionalism, and his father for admitting his mistake and changing his behavior. The divorce case itself was complicated. Thomas and Elizabeth had been married for 5 years, and they had substantial assets to divide. Elizabeth's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was known for being aggressive in court, but today he seemed subdued, perhaps influenced by the morning's events. Your Honor, Sarah continued, my client is willing to offer a fair settlement. We have prepared a detailed proposal that takes into account both parties' interests. She handed copies of the document to the clerk, who attributed them to the judge and Mr. Peterson. Judge Reynolds studied the proposal carefully, asking thoughtful questions about various points. His questions showed that he was treating this case like any other, not letting his personal connection to Thomas affect his judgment. During a brief break in the proceedings, other lawyers in the courtroom approached Sarah. Many of them had experienced similar treatment in their careers but had never spoken up. Seeing a judge of Reynolds' stature acknowledge and correct his bias gave them hope. Miss Mitchell, one young black female lawyer, whispered, what happened today, it means a lot to all of us. Thank you for standing your ground. Sarah smiled warmly at her, remembering her own early days in court when she felt alone and unsupported. As the morning progressed, the divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly. Elizabeth accepted most of the proposed settlement terms, with only a few points requiring negotiation. Judge Reynolds handled these negotiations fairly, showing no favoritism despite his son being involved. Near the end of the session, something unexpected happened. Elizabeth asked to speak directly to the court. Judge Reynolds allowed it, and she stood up, looking first at Thomas, then at Sarah. I want to say something, Elizabeth said softly. When we started this divorce, I was angry and wanted to fight about everything, but watching what happened here today, seeing how professionals handle difficult situations with dignity, it's changed my perspective. She turned to Thomas. The first think we can finish this amicably. The tension in the courtroom softened. Sarah glanced at Thomas, who nodded slightly. This was the breakthrough they had been hoping for. Judge Reynolds looked pleased but maintained his professional demeanor. Given this development, Judge Reynolds said, I suggest both parties take time to review the settlement terms one final time. We reconvene tomorrow morning to finalize the agreement. He looked at his watch. Court is adjourned for today. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Sarah packed up her briefcase, feeling satisfied with how the day had turned out. Not only had she handled her client's case effectively, but she had also sparked an important conversation about bias in the legal system. Judge Reynolds called out to her just as she was leaving. Miss Mitchell, a moment, please. She turned back and he added, I'd like to discuss your suggestions about making changes in our court system, perhaps over lunch. SS smiled and nodded. This difficult morning had opened a door for real change, and she was ready to walk through it. Sometimes she thought the most important victories in law happen outside the official court records. Sarah met Judge Reynolds at a small Italian restaurant 2 blocks from the courthouse. The place was quiet and private, perfect for the important conversation they were about to have. The judge had already arrived and was sitting at a corner table wearing a regular suit instead of his judicial robe. He looked more like a concerned father than a strict judge. Thank you for joining me, Miss Mitchell, Judge Reynolds said as Sarah sat down. He had ordered water for both of them, and the menus lay untouched on the table. I've been thinking a lot about what happened this morning, and about the documents you showed me. Sarah took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. Through the restaurant's window she could see the Corve house where just hours ago everything had changed. Your Honor, I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this. It's not easy to confront these issues. Please call me Harold when we're not in court, the judge said, his voice softer than it had been in the courtroom. I've been a judge for 15 years, and I've always believed I was fair to everyone, but today opened my eyes to something I hadn't wanted to see. The waiter came to take their orders, but neither of them had even looked at the menu. They asked for simple salads, too focused on their conversation to care much about food. Once the waiter left, Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out more documents. These are statistics from the past 5 years, she explained, spreading papers on the table. They show patterns of how different lawyers are treated in courtrooms across Boston. The numbers tell a clear story. Judge Reynolds put on his reading glasses and looked at the papers carefully. His face grew more serious as he read through the statistics. This is troubling, he said finally. Very troubling indeed. What's more troubling, Sarah added, is that most incidents go unreported. Many lawyers, especially young ones, are afraid to speak up. They worry it will hurt their careers. She paused, then continued, I've been collecting these stories for years, waiting for the right moment to do something about it. The waiter brought their salads, but both barely touched their food. Judge Reynolds was taking notes on a small pad he had pulled from his pocket. What do you suggest we do? He asked, looking up at Sarah. You clearly have given this a lot of thought. Sarah smiled slightly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. I have a 3-part plan, she said, pulling out another document. First, we need mandatory training for all court officials, judges, clerks, bailiffs, everyone. Second, we need a clear system for reporting and addressing bias incidents. And third, we need regular reviews of court decisions to look for patterns of unfair treatment. Judge Reynolds listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. This is good. Very good, he said. But it won't be easy. There will be resistance from some of my colleagues. That's why we need someone like you to lead this change, Sarah replied. You have respect in the legal community. When you admit to your own mistake and work to fix it, others will listen. Just then, Thomas walked into the restaurant. His father had texted him earlier, asking him to join them. He sat down at their table, looking between Sarah and his father. How's it going? He asked. Your father and I are discussing some important changes, Sarah said, showing him the papers on the table. Thomas looked at them, then at his father with newfound respect. Dad, are you really going to do this? Thomas asked. Take on the whole system? Judge Reynolds straightened in his chair. Son, when you make a mistake, you don't just apologize, you work to make sure it doesn't happen again. Miss Mitchell, Sarah, has shown me that my mistake this morning is part of a bigger problem, and as a judge, I have a responsibility to fix it. Sarah watched father and son share a moment of understanding. She thought about all the other lawyers who had faced similar situations but hadn't been lucky enough to have this opportunity for change. We'll start tomorrow, Judge Reynolds said firmly. They'll call a meeting with the other judges. Sarah, would you be willing to present your findings and plan? Of course, Sarah replied. This is why I became a lawyer, to make real change in the system. As they finished their lunch, all three knew that this was just the beginning. What had started as a difficult morning in court was turning into something much bigger, a chance to make the legal system fairer for everyone. 1 week after the incident in the courtroom, Sarah stood in the main conference room of the Boston courthouse. The room was filled with 30 judges, all sitting in their black robes, waiting to hear what she had to say. Judge Reynolds sat in the front row, giving her an encouraging nod. Sarah had spent the entire week preparing for this moment. She wore her lucky navy blue suit again, but this time she felt different. She wasn't just a lawyer presenting a case, she was someone trying to change the whole system. Good morning, Your Honors, Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. I'm here today to discuss something that affects every person in our legal system. She clicked her laptop, and the first slide appeared on the large screen behind her. The presentation showed real stories and numbers that couldn't be ignored. She shared examples of unfair treatment, backed up by statistics and data she had collected over the years. Some judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, clearly interested. Last week, Sarah continued, something happened in courtroom 3B that could have been just another story in my files. Instead, it became a turning point. She looked at Judge Reynolds, who stood up to join her at the front of the room. My colleagues, Judge Reynolds addressed the room, last week I made a mistake that opened my eyes. I treated a highly qualified lawyer with disrespect because of unconscious bias. That lawyer turned out to be my son's attorney. He paused, letting his words sink in. But the real issue isn't about who she was, it's about how we sometimes make quick judgments without thinking. The room was completely silent. Many of these judges had known Harold Reynolds for years, and seeing him admit his mistake publicly was powerful. Some of them began nodding, perhaps remembering their own similar moments. Sarah then presented her 3-part plan. As she explained each part, she could see more and more judges taking notes. Even the ones who had looked skeptical at first were now paying close attention. The training program will be practical and specific, Sarah explained, showing examples of real situations and how to handle them better. We're not here to blame anyone. We're here to make our legal system stronger and fairer for everyone. During the question and answer session, hands went up all around the room. One older judge, who had been on the bench for 30 years, spoke up. "Miss Mitchell, I've seen similar things in my courtroom, but I never knew how to address them. Your plan gives us concrete steps we can take." Another judge, a woman who had been one of the few females on the bench for years, added her support. "This isn't just about race or gender," she said. "It's about making sure everyone who comes into our courtrooms gets fair treatment." As the presentation went on, more judges began sharing their own experiences. Some talked about times they had seen bias in their courtrooms but hadn't known how to stop it. Others admitted to making similar mistakes themselves. Near the end of the session, Judge Reynolds made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I am creating a special committee to implement Miss Mitchell's plan," he said, "and am asking her to lead it." Sarah hadn't expected this. She looked at Judge Reynolds with surprise, but he continued speaking. Who better to lead this change than someone who not only identified the problem but also developed a solution? The judges voted right there to approve the plan. 28 out of 30 voted yes, making it official. Sarah would now be working directly with the court system to make real changes. As the meeting ended, judges came up to talk to Sarah one by one. Many wanted to be part of the committee, while others shared their own stories or offered support. What had started as one incident in one courtroom was growing into something much bigger. Thomas, who had been watching from the back of the room, came up to Sarah with a big smile. "You did it," he said proudly. "You actually did it." Sarah looked around the room, watching groups of judges still discussing the presentation. "No," she said thoughtfully. "We're just getting started. The real work begins now." Judge Reynolds joined them, looking more energized than he had in years. "Ready to change the world, Miss Mitchell?" he asked with a smile. Sarah gathered her presentation materials, thinking about all the future lawyers who would benefit from these changes. "One courtroom at a time, Your Honor," she replied. 6 months had passed since Sarah's presentation to the judges. The courthouse was a different place now. Signs around the building announced regular training sessions, and a new office had been set up specifically to handle reports of unfair treatment. Sarah's small idea had grown into something much bigger than she had ever imagined. On this particular morning, Sarah was conducting one of the training sessions she had designed. The room was full of new lawyers, judges, and court staff. At the back of the room sat Judge Reynolds, who never missed these sessions. He said it helped remind him of why they started this work. "Let's talk about real situations," Sarah said to the group. She had learned that people understood better when they discussed actual cases rather than just theories. "Can anyone share an experience they've had in court recently?" A young Asian lawyer raised her hand. "Last week, someone assumed I was the translator instead of the defense attorney," she said. "But because of the new reporting system, I knew exactly how to handle it. The situation was resolved right away." Sarah nodded, writing the example on the whiteboard. These were the kinds of stories she had been collecting for years, but now they were being used to create positive change. The room was filled with people taking notes and asking questions, all eager to learn. During the lunch break, Sarah sat with Judge Reynolds in his office. They had made it a habit to meet regularly to discuss the program's progress. On his desk was a report showing the results of their work so far. "The numbers are impressive," Judge Reynolds said, pointing to the statistics. "Complaints of unfair treatment are down by 40%. But more importantly, when problems do happen, they're being addressed immediately." Sarah smiled as she looked at the report. "And look at this," she added, turning to another page. "More minority lawyers are taking cases in our courthouse. They say they feel more welcome now." Thomas knocked on the door and joined them. He had become one of the program's biggest supporters, often speaking to other lawyers about his father's transformation. "Did you tell her about the award?" he asked his father. Judge Reynolds looked embarrassed. "I was getting to that," he said. "The State Bar Association wants to give our program an award for innovation in legal justice. They want to use it as a model for other courthouses across the state." Sarah was surprised. She hadn't started this work for awards or recognition. She had just wanted to make things better for other lawyers like herself. But the award meant their program would spread to other places, helping more people. Later that afternoon, Sarah watched a trial in courtroom 3B, the same room where everything had started 6 months ago. The lawyer presenting the case was a young black woman, fresh out of law school. Sarah noticed how differently things were now. The judge in the case, an older man who had been skeptical of the program at first, he listened carefully to the young lawyer's arguments. He asked questions respectfully and gave her time to explain her points. It was exactly the kind of change Sarah had hoped to see. After court, the young lawyer came up to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell," she said excitedly, "you don't know me, but you're the reason I chose to practice in Boston. When I heard about what you did here, I knew this was where I wanted to start my career." Sarah felt tears in her eyes but held them back. This was why she had worked so hard, not for herself, but for lawyers like this young woman, who deserved a fair chance to show their abilities. At the end of the day, Sarah packed up her things to head home. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she remembered that morning 6 months ago when she had climbed these same steps, nervous about her case with Thomas. Judge Reynolds was leaving at the same time. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked back at the building. "You know, Miss Mitchell," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the best things in life come from our biggest mistakes." Sarah nodded, thinking about how one difficult morning had led to all these changes. "It's not about the mistakes we make," she replied, "it's about what we do to fix them." As they walked to their cars, they discussed plans for expanding the program to other courthouses. What had started as one judge's mistake and one lawyer's courage had become a movement for change in the entire legal system. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 3B. The Boston courthouse was hosting a special ceremony in its largest hall. Lawyers, judges, and court staff from all over the state had gathered to celebrate the first anniversary of what people now called the Mitchell Program. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of over 300 people. She saw many familiar faces, including Judge Reynolds and Thomas in the front row, but what made her most proud were the many new faces, young lawyers of all backgrounds who now felt welcome in these halls of justice. 1 year ago, Sarah began her speech. "I walked into a courtroom expecting an ordinary day in court. Instead, something happened that changed not just my life, but our entire legal system." She paused, looking at Judge Reynolds, who smiled encouragingly. The hall was decorated with charts and graphs showing the program's success over the past year. 20 other courthouses across the state had adopted their training program. Reports of unfair treatment had dropped by 65%, and the number of minority lawyers practicing in state courts had increased by 40%. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Sarah continued. "The real success is in the stories I hear every day." She pointed to a young Hispanic lawyer in the audience. "Like Maria Torres, who won her first major case last month, or James Chin, who now runs our training program in Springfield." Judge Reynolds took the podium next. He looked different from the stern judge of a year ago. His face was warmer, his smile more frequent. "When Miss Mitchell first showed me those statistics in my chambers, I was ashamed," he admitted. "But she taught me that shame without action helps no one. It's what we do to create change that matters." The ceremony included a surprise announcement. The state Supreme Court had decided to make the Mitchell Program mandatory for all courthouses in Massachusetts. What had started with one incident in one courtroom would now help ensure fair treatment across the entire state. Thomas stood up to share his story too. "A year ago, my father fined my lawyer without realizing who she was," he said, making the audience laugh. Today, he and Sarah work together to make sure nobody faces that kind of treatment again. Sometimes, the best partnerships come from unexpected places. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the courthouse lobby. Sarah walked around, talking to young lawyers who shared their experiences. One conversation particularly touched her heart. A young black woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "Miss Mitchell," the young lawyer said, "I almost quit law school last year because I was afraid I wouldn't be treated fairly in court. But then I read about what you did here. You gave me hope." Today, I won my first case in this very courthouse. Sarah hugged the young woman, remembering her own early days as a lawyer. She had faced many challenges, but she had never imagined that standing up for herself one morning would lead to such widespread change. Judge Reynolds joined them, carrying a special plaque they would hang in the courthouse entrance, telling the story of how one morning's mistake led to positive change. The plaque's final words read, "Justice is not just about laws. It's about how we treat each other in these halls." As the evening ended, Sarah, Thomas, and Judge Reynolds stood on the courthouse steps where their story had begun 1 year ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in beautiful colors. "Did you ever imagine that morning would lead to all this?" Thomas asked, looking at the crowd of people still mingling inside. Sarah shook her head. "I just wanted to be treated fairly," she said. "But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who comes after you." Judge Reynolds put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You know, next month we start training programs in New York and California. They want to use our model nationwide." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the future lawyers who would benefit from these changes. What had started as a difficult moment between a judge and a lawyer had grown into a movement that was changing the legal system across the country. As they walked down the courthouse steps one last time that evening, Sarah thought about how sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. All it takes is one person willing to stand up, one person willing to admit they were wrong, and the courage to work together to make things better. The story of the white judge and the black lawyer had become more than just a story. It had become a blueprint for change, showing that justice works best when everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are.